February 11, 1944, 25,000 feet above the snow-dusted fields of western Germany. The air is thin and bitterly cold. A single Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, call sign Big Stud, holds formation loosely with a returning bomber stream. Its massive radial engine hums steadily, propeller blades slicing through frozen stratospheric air. Inside the cramped cockpit, Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson scans the horizon through frost-edged glass. Then they come, for black dots rising fast from the east. Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek, predatory, flown by pilots who have owned these skies for years. Over the German radio frequencies, laughter. The FW-190 pilots see the lone American fighter bolt, seemingly slow, separated from its group. Easy prey, a confidence born from hundreds of kills, from watching Spitfires fall and Thunderbolts run. Johnson's gloved hand tightens on the stick. They close to 800 yards. 600 Germans spread into attack formation, preparing for what they believe will be a quick, clean kill. The sky's about to teach them otherwise. By the winter of 1944, the air war over Europe had become a brutal calculus of altitude, speed, and firepower. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a daylight strategic bombing campaign, a doctrine born from the belief that precision attacks on German industry could cripple the Nazi war machine. But precision required daylight, and daylight made the bombers visible. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-2 for Liberators flew in tight formations. Their combined defensive firepower meant to ward off enemy fighters. But the Luftwaffe had learned. German pilots attacked from head-on, exploiting the bombers' weakest defensive arcs. They used vertical dives, slashing attacks, and coordinated assaults that overwhelmed gunners. Between July and October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost over 600 bombers. The entire squadrons vanished in single missions. The problem was range. American escort fighters initially, P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts, could only accompany the bombers partway into Germany before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. Beyond that invisible line, the bombers flew alone into what crews grimly called the Gauntlet. German fighters waited just beyond escort range, timing their attacks with lethal precision. Luftwaffe aces like Egon Meyer and Georg Peter Eder perfected tactics specifically designed to exploit this vulnerability. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered service in early 1943 with mixed expectations. Designed by Alexander Kartveli and Republic Aviation, it was a radial engine heavyweight over 7 tons fully loaded. Pilots nicknamed it the Jug for its resemblance to a milk jug, though some claimed it stood for Juggernaut. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, it featured a massive turbocharger that gave it exceptional high-altitude performance, but perception lagged behind. Capability pilots transferring from nimble P-51 Mustangs or British Spitfires found the Thunderbolt cumbersome. It didn't turn like a European fighter. Its roll rate at low speeds felt sluggish. Early combat reports were cautious, sometimes critical. Some pilots doubted whether this American heavyweight could survive against the Luftwaffe's best, the FW-190 and the Bf-109G. German pilots certainly doubted it. LUFTWAFFE intelligence reports from mid-1943 noted the P-47's arrival with clinical interest but little concern. The aircraft was large, which meant an easy target. Its radial engine suggested vulnerability. Liquid-cooled inline engines like those in the FW-190A could be better streamlined, theoretically offering speed advantages. German training emphasized energy tactics, diving attacks that converted altitude into speed, then climbing back to safety. Against a heavy aircraft, these tactics should dominate. Jagdgeschwader units across occupied France and Germany received tactical briefings. The Thunderbolt could be beaten in a turning fight. It could be outmaneuvered at medium altitudes. If engaged properly, it would fall like the others. This confidence wasn't baseless. The Luftwaffe's fighter corps in early 1944 still contained hardened veteransmen who had flown since the Battle of Britain, who had hundreds of sorties over the Eastern Front, who knew the physics of aerial combat with intimate, lethal precision. They had destroyed Spitfire Mk versus over Dieppe. They had shredded Soviet Yak-9 south over Kursk. One more Allied fighter type seemed like one more variation on a familiar theme, but the Thunderbolt carried secrets the Germans hadn't yet measured. Its 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns delivered a combined rate of fire exceeding 100 rounds per second. Each gun carried between 267 and 425 rounds, depending on position. The ammunition was a mix of ball, tracer, armor-piercing, and incendiary enough to soar through a Focke-Wulf's wing spar or detonate a fuel tank in seconds of sustained fire. The aircraft's armored cockpit bathtub weighed nearly 200 pounds, protecting the pilot from frontal and side attacks. The radial engine, often mocked for its size, could absorb horrific damage, and keep running cylinders could be shot away entirely, and the engine would still produce partial power. Most importantly, The P-47 could dive at high altitude. The Thunderbolt's weight became an advantage. In a dive, it accelerated faster than almost any fighter in the European theater. Approaching 550 miles per hour in steep descents, German pilots trained to escape by diving away, but against a Thunderbolt, that escape route closed. The American fighter could follow, overtake, and bring those 8 machine guns to bear before the enemy reached safer altitudes. None of this had fully registered in Luftwaffe tactical consciousness by February 1944. The learning curve was about to steepen dramatically. The European theater of operations in early 1944 was a chessboard where every piece mattered, and the stakes were measured in young men's lives. The Allied invasion of continental Europe loomed. Planners knew that D-Day, whenever it came, would require total air superiority. The Luftwaffe had to be broken first, driven from the skies, its pilots killed or grounded, its infrastructure shattered. But breaking the Luftwaffe meant surviving it first. 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe, England, studied loss reports with grim attention. Mission after mission returned with fewer aircraft than departed. The raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943 cost 60 B-17s in a single day, 600 men dead, missing, or captured. The numbers were unsustainable. Fighter escort wasn't a luxury, it was existential necessity. The P-47 units assigned to escort duty operated under severe constraints. External fuel tanks extended their range, but only marginally at first. Early drop tanks were unreliable, sometimes failing to feed fuel properly or refusing to jettison when empty. Pilots had to calculate fuel burn rates constantly, knowing that every minute deeper into Germany meant one less minute of combat endurance for the return journey. The 56th Fighter Group, stationed at Halesworth in Suffolk, became the primary P-47 unit, proving the aircraft's worth, commanded by Colonel Hubert Zemke, a tactician who understood both engineering and combat psychology. The 56th developed aggressive tactics that played to the Thunderbolt's strengths. Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly. Never try to turn with a German fighter at low altitude. Use speed. Use altitude. Dive. Attack. Climb back to safety. Fight the aircraft's fight, not the enemy's. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson joined the 56th in early 1943. He was 22 years old. Raised in Lawton, Oklahoma. Trained in the vast skies over the American Southwest, where visibility stretched forever and airspace belonged to anyone bold enough to claim it. He was not a natural pilot. Instructors noted he was adequate but not exceptional. What he possessed was something harder to quantify, an unshakable determination and an engineer's mind that understood machinery. Johnson learned the P-47 intimately. He studied its flight characteristics, its engine tolerances, the way it handled at different altitudes and speeds. He practiced gunnery until his deflection shooting became instinctive, and he adopted Zemke's tactical gospel: completely never fight the enemy's fight. By February 1944, Johnson had flown dozens of combat missions. He had engaged FW-190s and Bf-109s over occupied France and Western Germany. He had seen friends die, aircraft exploding in midair, pilots bailing out over enemy territory, the sudden empty space in formation where a wingman used to fly. He knew what the Luftwaffe could do, but he also knew what the Thunderbolt could do. The Focke-Wulf 190A that dominated German fighter wings by 1944 was a masterpiece of engineering, designed by Kurt Tank. It featured a BMW 801 radial engine, but streamlined in ways American designers hadn't attempted. Its armament varied by variant, but typically included 2 or 4 20mm cannons plus machine guns, devastating firepower concentrated in the nose. It rolled faster than almost any Allied fighter. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was lethal. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, the other Luftwaffe mainstay, brought different strengths: lighter, more nimble at altitude, with a climb rate that could catch bombers before escorts arrived. Together, these two aircraft types had ruled European skies since 1940. Their pilots had learned their trade in the skies over Britain, over Russia, over the Mediterranean. They were professionals in the business of killing. German tactical doctrine emphasized the Schwammerfer aircraft formation, providing mutual support while maintaining tactical flexibility. Pairs of fighters worked together, one engaging while the other covered, alternating roles fluidly. Against bombers, they used frontal attacks, diving from above and ahead, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing into the cockpit and nose section where defensive fire was weakest, then breaking away before the formation's massed guns could track them. Against escort fighters, they used altitude and energy. Luftwaffe pilots tried to position themselves above American escorts, forcing the P-47s to climb burning fuel and losing speed before initiating combat. If the Americans took the bait, they entered the fight disadvantaged. If they didn't, the German fighters had free rein to attack the bombers. It was a tactical chess game played at 400 miles per hour, but the game was changing in ways German intelligence hadn't fully grasped. American fighter production was overwhelming. For every P-47 shot down, 3 more arrived from American factories. Luftwaffe replacement rates couldn't match that arithmetic. Experienced German pilots were being diluted among less-trained replacements. Combat exhaustion was setting in, and the Americans were learning. Pilots like Johnson were no longer novices. They had survived long enough to understand the rules. They had adapted tactics, learned to exploit the Thunderbolt's genuine advantages. Abandoned attempts to dogfight where the aircraft couldn't win. The 56th Fighter Group's kill ratios were climbing steadily through late 1943 and early 1944, but perception still lagged behind reality. German pilots still saw the bulky Thunderbolt as inferior, big, slow, a target rather than a threat. This perception was about to collide with fact at 25,000 feet over Germany. On February 11, 1944, Johnson was flying alone after his squadron scattered during a chaotic engagement with Bf-109s near Hanover. His radio crackled with distant transmissions, other pilots calling out positions, altitude, enemy fighters. He was low on ammunition from an earlier engagement, nursing his fuel carefully, heading west toward England. That's when the 4 Focke-Wulfs found him. Oberleutnant Heinrich Steins led the He was a veteran with 18 kills. Confident in his aircraft and his training, when he spotted the lone P-47 below and ahead, he likely smiled. The tactical situation was perfect: altitude advantage, numerical superiority, an isolated enemy. He radioed his wingman, aligned his attack vector, and began his dive. The sky held its breath. Inside the cramped cockpit of Big Stud, Robert Johnson felt the temperature drop as his altitude held steady at 25,000 feet. The oxygen mask pressed against his face, each breath a conscious effort through the regulated flow. His hands, even through heated gloves, ached with cold. The plexiglass canopy framed a world of white clouds below and endless blue. Above, beautiful and utterly indifferent to whether he lived or died in the next 10 minutes. He saw them coming before his wingman's warning crackled through the radio. 4 black shapes climbing fast from his 7 o'clock low. Focke-Wulf's the silhouette was unmistakable: the broad wings, the aggressive stance, the way they moved with predatory purpose. His heart rate increased, adrenaline sharpening his senses. Training took over, but so did something else: the weight of being alone. Every fighter pilot's nightmare was isolation. In formation, you had eyes watching your 6th wingman who could call out threats, mutual support that multiplied survival odds. Alone, you were naked. Every decision was yours alone. Every mistake would be paid for in full. Johnson's mind ran through options with mechanical speed. He couldn't outrun them. They had altitude and speed advantage in the dive. He couldn't call for help. His squadron was scattered, minutes away at best. He could try to dive for the deck, but that meant surrendering altitude, his only real advantage, and hoping the Thunderbolt's dive speed would carry him out of range before they closed firing distance. Or he could fight. The Luftwaffe pilots expected him to run. Their tactics assumed Allied fighters would break defensive, try to escape, become targets fleeing predictably. Johnson understood this. Zemke had drilled it into every pilot. They expect you to be afraid. Use that. He throttled back slightly, appearing to maintain course. A pilot who hadn't seen them yet, or who was paralyzed by fear. Let him commit. Let them believe their own assumptions. His thumb moved to the gun switch, flipping it to armed. 8 Browning machine guns, charged, ready. His breathing steadied. The fear didn't live, it never did, but it became something he could use. Fuel for the hyper-awareness that separated survivors from casualties. Behind him, the Focke-Wulf spread into attack formation. Steins would take the lead shot. The others would bracket, cutting off escape angles. Standard swarm tactics. Textbook. Johnson waited. The distance closed. 800 yards. 700. His hand steady. On the stick. In that moment, he carried more than his own life. He carried the reputation of his aircraft, the credibility of American fighter doctrine, the faith of every bomber crew who needed escorts to survive. The Luftwaffe believed the Thunderbolt was inferior. They believed American pilots were inexperienced, reckless, easy to kill. He intended to disprove both assumptions. Aerial combat in World War II was applied physics delivered at lethal speeds. Every maneuver, every tactical decision was a calculation of an unconscious, learned through training and survival of energy states, turn rates, and firing solutions. The aircraft that could control the energy equation controlled the fight. The Focke-Wulf 190 had specific advantages. Its roll rate at combat speeds exceeded 150 degrees per second faster than the P-47, faster than almost any Allied fighter. This meant German pilots could reverse direction rapidly, changing their attack angle before an opponent could react. The FW-190's armament was devastating at close range. The 20mm MG-151 cannons fired explosive shells that could tear apart airframe structures with a single hit. But every advantage carried a corresponding weakness. The FW-190's radial engine, despite Kurt Tank's brilliant streamlining, still created more drag than inline engines. In sustained dives, this drag became significant. The aircraft's relatively light wing loading made it maneuverable at medium altitudes, but less stable in high-speed dives. Pilots had to be careful not to exceed structural limits too. FW-1090 could reach compressibility speeds where control surfaces became ineffective, where the aircraft wanted to pitch nose down uncontrollably. The P-47, by contrast, was built like a tank that happened to fly. Its wing loading was higher, meaning it didn't turn as tightly at slow speeds but in a dive. That weight became pure kinetic advantage. The Thunderbolt's airframe was stressed to withstand 8G maneuvers. Its control surfaces remained effective at speeds that would leave other fighters wallowing. Republic engineers had designed it to survive, and survival often meant diving away from trouble faster than trouble could follow. Johnson knew these numbers instinctively. He knew that if the FW-190s committed to their dive attack, they would accelerate to around 400 miles per hour. Fast, but not fast enough. The Thunderbolt at full power in a dive could reach 500, even 550 miles per hour, if he could get his nose down first. If he could convert his altitude into speed before they closed firing range, he could reverse the engagement geometry entirely. The tactical problem was timing. Dive too early, and they would adjust, cutting him off. Dive too late, and they would get guns on target. The window for action was measured in seconds. Steins and his wingmen close to 600 yards. Standard firing range for experienced pilots was 300 yards or less, close enough for deflection shooting to be accurate, close enough for cannon shells to strike with full kinetic energy. They were still closing, still confident, still assuming the American would break defensive or freeze. Johnson's tactical advantage was psychological as much as mechanical. He understood what they expected. He could shape their expectations, then exploit them. It was a gamble if he misjudged their closing speed or his own aircraft's capabilities. He would die, but staying passive guaranteed death. Action, even risky action, offered survival. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns were synchronized to converge at 300 yards to the point where all 8 streams of fire intersected in a cone of destruction roughly 6 feet in diameter. Inside that cone, metal disintegrated, airframes came apart, engines seized, pilots died. Johnson needed to create that geometry. He needed those FW-190s inside his cone. Oberlein and Heinrich Steins had flown combat missions since 1942. He had survived the savage air battles over the Eastern Front, where Soviet fighters came in waves and survival required not just skill but stamina. Flying for 5 sorties a day, always outnumbered, always low on fuel and ammunition. He had transitioned to the Western Front in late 1943, where the fighting was different but no less deadly. He respected the American bombers. Their formations were tight, their gunners disciplined. Attacking a B-17 Bok required precision and courage. The combined defensive fire could shred a fighter in seconds. But the escort fighters were another matter. The P-38s were clumsy at altitude. The early P-47s seemed uncertain, their pilots cautious, willing to break off rather than press an engagement. The intelligence briefings confirmed his observations. American pilots were brave, but inexperienced. They had training hours but lacked combat instinct. They relied on numbers and production rather than skill. Given equal odds, a Luftwaffe veteran should dominate. Seeing the lone Thunderbolts, Steins felt the tactical satisfaction of a perfect setup. The American was isolated, low on options, likely low on fuel. 4 against 1, altitude advantage. The classic formula for an easy kill. He signaled his wingman Atrophisia Klaus Schrader on his right, Feldwebel Ottomeyer and Jeffrey Hans Weber in the second element. They spread into attack formation smoothly, the product of hundreds of hours flying together. Steins would engage first, force in the P-47 to react. Schrader would bracket left, cutting off that escape angle. Meyer and Weber would position high, ready to dive on the American if he broke right or tried to climb. It was textbook. It had worked dozens of times before. Steins checked his armament panel to MG-151 20th cannons, 250 rounds each, plus 2 MG-17 machine guns, more than enough. He adjusted his gun sight, calculating deflection for a target moving at approximately 300 miles per hour. The American's flight path was straight, steady. Either he hadn't seen them, or he was paralyzed with fear. Either way, the outcome seemed certain. The distance closed to 500 yards. Steins' finger moved to the firing button on his stick, almost in range. He could already see the victory report: 1 P-47 destroyed. Shared credit with his wingman perhaps, but primarily his kill. It would be number 19. What Steins didn't calculate, what Luftwaffe intelligence hadn't properly assessed, was the possibility that the Americans' behavior wasn't fear or incompetence, that the straight, steady flight path was deliberate, that the lone Thunderbolt wasn't prey frozen in terror, but bait in a trap. Now the assumption of superiority was about to cost him everything. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to survive, to fight, and to bring its pilot home. Every pound of its 7-ton mass served a purpose, and that purpose was lethality wrapped in armor. At the heart of the aircraft sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp-Span 80-cylinder, twin-row radial engine that was less a motor and more a controlled explosion happening 2,700 times per minute. It produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, fed by a turbocharger mounted in the rear fuselage that compressed thin Hyper-2D air back into breathable density for the engine. This system gave the P-47 exceptional performance above 25,000 feet, where most fighters began to struggle. The radial engine configuration that German pilots mocked was actually a survival feature, unlike inline engines with vulnerable coolant systems, where a single bullet through a radiator meant gradual power loss and eventual seizure. The R2800 could lose entire cylinders and continue running. Each cylinder was semi-independent. Pilots had returned to base with 3, 4, even 5 cylinders shot away. The engine running rough but running. Oil fires could be extinguished by diving, using airspeed to blow out flames. The massive engine block itself acted as additional frontal armor, absorbing fire that would have killed pilots in other aircraft. Behind the engine sat nearly 200 pounds of armor plate formed into a bathtub shape surrounding the pilot's seat and lower body. The steel was half an inch thick in critical areas. Rated to stop 20mm cannon shells at oblique angles and .50 caliber fire at almost any angle. The windscreen was laminated bulletproof glass, 2 inches thick in early engagements. P-47 pilots had reported being hit dozens of times and walking away the aircraft absorbed punishment that would have disintegrated lighter fighters. But the Thunderbolt's most significant technological advantage was its armament convergence philosophy. 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side, staggered to fit within the wing structure. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute, throwing half-ounce bullets at 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition mix was carefully designed: ball rounds for penetration, armor-piercing, incendiary for fuel tanks and engines, tracer for aiming correction at 300 yards. All 8 guns converged. The combined weight of fire was devastating, over 100 rounds per second, impacting a target area roughly the size of a dinner table. The kinetic energy was sufficient to saw through aircraft aluminum, sever control cables, detonate fuel vapors, shatter cockpit canopies. A 2-second burst delivered 400 rounds into the target. Nothing in the Luftwaffe inventory could withstand that concentrated firepower. The drawback was ammunition consumption. Johnson had already fired several bursts earlier in the mission. His ammunition counters showed roughly 40% remaining. 4, perhaps 2 sustained bursts, or 3 short ones. He would have to make every round count. The P-47's hydraulic system powered the flight control's ailerons elevator, rudder, making the aircraft surprisingly responsive despite its weight. At high speeds, control forces increased, but remained manageable. The aircraft was stable in dives, honest in its handling. It didn't snap into spins. It didn't have vicious stall characteristics. It was, in the language of test pilots, a pilot's airplane: predictable, forgiving, capable. Johnson trusted his machine completely. He had flown this particular P-47 tail number 226,490 4 months. He knew its quirks: a slight tendency to pull left on takeoff, the way the trim needed adjustment above 20,000 feet, the exact throttle position for maximum range cruise. The aircraft had brought him home through flak and fighters. It would do so again, or they would die together. The tactical situation developing at 25,000 feet above Germany was not random. It was the direct result of doctrine, the systematized thinking about how air combat should be conducted, developed through analysis, training, and painful lessons learned in blood. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, had studied every combat report from his unit and others. He had interviewed returning pilots, analyzed gun camera footage, calculated ammunition expenditure versus kill ratios. He had identified patterns. Pilots who survived tended to fight a specific way, using altitude and speed rather than turning combat. Pilots who died often violated those principles, trying to dogfight German fighters in scenarios where the P-47 couldn't win. Zemke formalized this understanding into operational doctrine. He banned low altitude turning combat except in emergency situations. He mandated altitude discipline. Escort fighters would maintain height advantage over both bombers and likely German intercept altitudes. He emphasized teamwork: never fight alone unless absolutely necessary. Always maintain formation integrity. But Zemke also understood that doctrine had to account for reality. Fights became chaotic. Formations scattered. Pilots got separated. When that happened, individual skill and aircraft capability determined survival. So he trained his pilots to think independently within doctrinal boundaries. If isolated, don't panic. Use the aircraft's strengths. Don't try to be a Spitfire or be a Thunderbolt. Johnson had absorbed this teaching completely. He had watched pilots die because they tried to outturn FW-190s at low altitude. Physically impossible given the aircraft's performance envelopes. He had seen others survive impossible odds because they used speed and vertical maneuvers. fighting in 3 dimensions rather than 2. The leadership philosophy extended beyond individual tactics. 8th Air Force Command, under General Jimmy Doolittle, had recently revised fighter doctrine to emphasize offensive action. Previously, escort fighters stayed close to bombers, reacting to German attacks. The new doctrine authorized fighters to pursue and destroy German aircraft aggressively. Even if it meant leaving the immediate bomber formation, the logic was straightforward. Dead German fighters couldn't attack bombers. Air superiority came from destroying the enemy, not just defending targets. This philosophical shift empowered pilots like Johnson to take calculated risks. If an opportunity to kill German fighters presented itself, he was expected to take it. The mission wasn't just to escort bombers home, it was to destroy the Luftwaffe on the German side. Leadership doctrine had calcified around assumptions formed earlier in the war. Luftwaffe tactical manuals still emphasized the Schwarm formation and energy tactics. Developed against Spitfires and Hurricanes, training focused on vertical maneuvers, diving attacks and quick disengagement. This doctrine had worked brilliantly in 1940 and 1941. It still worked against many Allied fighters. But doctrine that doesn't evolve becomes dogma, and dogma kills. Steins was flying exactly as his training and experience dictated. His tactical approach was correct according to Luftwaffe doctrine. 4 against 1. Altitude advantage. Coordinated attack. Everything by the book. The book hadn't been updated to account for pilots who refused to follow the script. War is built on calculations, tonnage of bombs, fuel consumption rates, aircraft production numbers. But beneath the statistics runs a more dangerous calculation. The assumption of superiority. It begins rationally, based on evidence, better training, more experience, proven victories. Then it metastasizes into something else, contempt. The Luftwaffe pilots diving toward Johnson weren't evil men. They were professionals doing a job they believed was necessary. But they carried with them an assumption that had become structural, that German engineering was superior, that German training produced better pilots, that American mass production was quantity trying to compensate for quality. This assumption had historical roots. The Luftwaffe had dominated European skies for years. German pilots had seen French fighters fall by the hundreds. British Spitfires had been respected enemies, but ultimately defeated over France. Soviet aircraft had arrived in waves and died in waves. The pattern reinforced itself: we win because we are better. American entry into the war hadn't changed this perception. Initial engagements with P-38s and early P-47s had been favorable to the Germans. Allied pilots seemed tentative, unwilling to press attacks. German victory reports accumulated. Each confirmed kill reinforced the assumption. But assumptions built on past performance can blind you to present reality. The Americans weren't static. They were learning, adapting, improving. Pilots like Johnson weren't the inexperienced novices who had first flown combat in 1943. They were survivors who had distilled their lessons into instinct. The moral hazard of contempt is that it replaces analysis with attitude. Steins wasn't being stupid or reckless. He was being rational based on incomplete information. His intelligence briefings told him the P-47 was inferior in turning combat. His experience confirmed that Allied pilots often broke defensive. His squadron's kill ratio validated his tactical approach. What he couldn't calculate, the intelligence briefing could fully convey, was the determination of a single pilot who had survived long enough to stop being afraid of death and start being angry about being underestimated. Johnson had watched friends die. He had seen B-17s streaming fire, plunging toward Earth with 10 men inside. He had heard the radio calls, the desperate, fading voices of pilots hit, bleeding, dying. He carried those voices with him every time he flew. They weren't abstract. They had names, faces, families waiting for letters that would never come. The Germans thought he would run. They expected fear to dictate his response. What they encountered instead was something more dangerous. Controlled fury backed by 2,000 horsepower and 8 machine guns. The moral equation was simple: survive, or validate their contempt with your death. Johnson chose survival, and survival meant killing everyone trying to kill him. The distance closed to 400 yards. Steins's finger tightened on the trigger. Johnson pushed the stick forward and dove. The moment Johnson pushed the stick forward, physics took command. The P-47's nose dropped sharply, the horizon line sweeping upward through the canopy as 7 tons of aircraft and fuel and ammunition surrendered to gravity. The airspeed indicator needle climbed 320 miles per hour. 340. 360. The engine roared louder as ram air forced itself into the intake. The turbocharger screaming to compress and feed the cylinders. Wind noise increased to a howl around the canopy edges. The control stick grew heavier in Johnson's hands as aerodynamic forces multiplied against the control surfaces behind and above. Steins experienced a half-second of confusion. The American had committed to a dive, the expected defensive maneuver, but the angle was wrong. Too steep, too aggressive. Not the dive of an aircraft fleeing, but the dive of an aircraft accelerating into attack geometry. Steins adjusted instinctively, pushing his own stick forward to follow. His wingman mirrored the maneuver, maintaining formation discipline. The four Focke-Wulfs entered their dives in sequence, separated by milliseconds. Their BMW 801 engines roared at full power. They had altitude advantage, momentum, numerical superiority. The American was still within reach, but the reach was closing differently than Stynes expected. At 380 miles per hour, the P-47's dive steepened further. Johnson's altimeter unwound rapidly. 24,000 feet, 23,500, 23,000. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as he pulled slight back pressure to prevent the dive from going completely vertical. His vision remained clear. The G-suit wasn't necessary yet, the forces still within human tolerance. The engine temperature gauge climbed slightly, but well within operational limits. Everything was responding exactly as it should. The Focke-Wulfs were falling behind. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to the casual observer. But the gap between hunter and prey was widening by feet per second. The P-47's greater weight, its cleaner dive characteristics, its airframe designed to withstand high-speed stress all combined to create an acceleration curve the FW-190s couldn't match. Stynes pushed his throttle to the stop, urging every possible revolution from his engine. But the laws of physics were indifferent to will. At 420 miles per hour, Johnson began his recovery arc. It wasn't a pull-up, not yet. It was a gradual curving of the dive, trading vertical speed for horizontal speed and beginning to reposition his aircraft's nose. The stick came back smoothly, progressively, the controls heavy but responsive. The G-forces built 3 gigaseconds. 4 gigaseconds, his body growing heavier, his vision beginning to narrow at the edges as blood pooled away from his brain. He grunted against the pressure, forcing blood back up through tensed muscles. The G-suit squeezed his legs and abdomen, mechanical assistance against unconsciousness. The nose came up through the horizon, sky above, earth below, his flight path now a climbing arc rather than a dive. Airspeed still 400 miles per hour, altitude 21,000 feet, and now he could see them clearly, the Focke-Wulfs strung out in their own dive, trying to follow his maneuver but starting from higher altitude, starting with less speed, starting with the wrong assumptions about what he would do next. Johnson continued the pull, tightening the arc. The G-forces peaked at 6 gigaseconds, his body weighing over 1,000 pounds, his arms led in his vision a tunnel. But the P-47's airframe handled it without complaint. No structural groaning, no control flutter, no indication that the aircraft was anywhere near its limits. Republic's engineers had built margin into every rivet and spar. That margin was keeping him alive. The maneuver high-speed dive followed by a climbing reversal had repositioned the geometry completely. Johnson was no longer below the German fighters. He was now level with them, approaching from an oblique angle, his speed still superior, and the FW-190s were committed to their dive, unable to reverse quickly without bleeding energy. They didn't have .Steinz recognized the danger too late. His tactical advantage had evaporated in seconds. The 4-against-1 superiority meant nothing if he couldn't bring guns to bear. His altitude advantage was gone. They were colditude now, and the American had speed. His plan had been predicated on the P-47 doing what P-47s were supposed to do on a way, dive for the deck, flee toward friendly territory. This one had turned into the attack. Stynes broke left, trying to convert his dive into a defensive spiral that would force the American to pull harder, to bleed speed in the turn, to create a gun solution for his wingman. Schrader broke right, attempting to bracket. Meyer and Weber split high and low, trying to maintain mutual support while repositioning for a second attack run. Standard doctrine, textbook response to a reversed engagement. Johnson ignored the three splitting away and focused on Stynes' single target. Focus was both a blessing and a curse in air combat. It eliminated distractions, sharpened intent, created the tunnel vision necessary for accurate shooting, but it also made you vulnerable to the targets you weren't watching. Johnson's tactical calculation was simple: kill one fast, then deal with the others. Let them worry about their flight leader dying. Let fear enter their decision-making. He pulled lead on Stynes' banking Focke-Wulf, the gunsight Pipper tracking ahead of the target, calculating deflection instinctively, speed differential, angle off, range closing. His thumb rested on the gun trigger. Not yet. 400 yards. It's still too far for a certain kill. Ammunition was limited. Every round had to count. Stynes' brake tightened. The FW-190's superior roll rate was evident, the aircraft snapping through nearly 120 degrees of bank in under a second. But the maneuver cost speed, and speed was life. The German fighter's airspeed dropped through 350 miles per hour. The P-47 was still carrying 380, closing the gap geometrically, 350 yards. Johnson's breathing steadied. The Pipper hung just ahead of the FW-190's engine cowling, tracking smoothly despite the turbulence, despite the knowledge that 3 other German fighters were somewhere in his blind. spots repositioning to kill him. Steins reversed his brake, rolling right now, trying to throw off the firing solution. Johnson followed smoothly, the P-47's heavier controls actually helping. No twitchiness, no over-control, just steady pressure translating into steady tracking. The Pippa stayed locked. 300 yards. Johnson pressed the trigger. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. 8 machine guns fired simultaneously. Their muzzles staggered along the wings, creating a rhythmic stutter that shook the entire airframe. Spent shell casings and belt links erupted from the ejection ports, streaming behind the wings in glittering arcs. Tracer rounds, every 5th bullet drew visible lines of fire through the air, converging on the target like incandescent threads being woven into a deadly tapestry. The first rounds struck the Focke-Wulf's left wing root. Armor-piercing incendiary bullets punched through aluminum skin, through structural stringers, through the fuel tank beneath. The aviation gasoline high-octane volatile ignited instantly. Orange flame blossomed from the wing, fed by pressurized fuel and oxygen-rich airflow. Steins felt the impact, a series of hammering thuds transmitted through the airframe, the controls going mushy as hydraulic lines severed. The aircraft, yawing hard left as asymmetric drag from the burning wing overcame his rudder input. He tried to roll right, to recover control, but the ailerons were only partially responsive. The fire was spreading, consuming the wing from root to tip. Johnson held the trigger for exactly 2 seconds. The stopwatch in his mind counted it unconsciously, training taking over, preventing him from wasting ammunition on a target already dying. 40 rounds per gun, 320 bullets, a significant portion of his remaining ammunition. But the result was undeniable. The Focke-Wulf's wing folded upward at midspan, structural failure from fire and bullet damage. The aircraft snap-rolled inverted, its aerodynamic stability destroyed, centrifugal force pulling Steins against his harness straps. The cockpit filled with smoke, the windscreen cracked from thermal stress. Steins reached for the canopy jettison handle. His training was absolute. Who didn't ride a burning aircraft down? You jumped, you pulled the ripcord, you took your chances with capture over certain death by fire. His hand found the handle. He pulled. The canopy blasted away in the slipstream. Freezing air at 200 miles per hour rushed into the cockpit, feeding the fire, pulling maps and loose equipment into the void. Steins released his harness, pushed himself up and back, trusting momentum and airflow to carry him clear of the tail section. He tumbled into space, the burning fighter spiraling away below him. His hand found the ripcord. He pulled. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk. His descent suddenly arrested. The chaotic violence of combat replaced by the eerie quiet of slow descent through cold air. Below him, his Focke-Wulf continued its death spiral, trailing black smoke, pieces breaking away, the fire consuming everything combustible. It impacted a snow-covered field at over 400 miles per hour. The explosion was visible for miles, a brief orange fireball, then black smoke rising against the white landscape. Steins hung in his parachute harness, watching the smoke, feeling the cold, knowing he was alive but defeated. Somewhere above, the battle continued. Johnson had already moved on. The moment Steins's aircraft began its death spiral, the tactical equation changed for his wingmen. What had been a coordinated attack with numerical superiority became something else, a scattered fight where survival instincts competed with tactical discipline. Schrader saw his flight leaders, FW-190 burning, saw the parachute deploy, saw the lone American P-47 pulling out of its gun run with terrifying economy of motion. No wasted energy, no panicked maneuvering, just efficient, lethal action. The confidence that had characterized their initial intercept evaporated. This wasn't an inexperienced American. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Schrader's training told him to press the attack. 4 had become 3, but 3 against 1 still favored the Germans. Coordinate with Meyer and Weber. Use altitude, use numbers, kill the American before he killed anyone else. But training competed with the primal survival instinct that had kept him alive through 2 years of combat. The American had just destroyed his flight leader in seconds. Those 8 machine guns, the firepower was devastating, and the P-47's maneuverability at high speed defied everything the briefings had said. Schrader made his decision. He broke off, rolling into a steep climbing turn away from the engagement. Throttle to maximum, trying to gain separation in altitude. It wasn't cowardice, it was tactical reassessment. The engagement geometry had become unfavorable. Better to disengage, survive, report the encounter. Let intelligence revise their assessments of American capabilities. Johnson saw the break. 1 down, 1 running. That left 2 we pulled hard, right? Scanning the sky, his neck muscles straining against the GI forces as he searched for the remaining threats. There, high and left, 2 FW-190s separating, trying to create a pinch. Meyer and Weber, still committed to the fight, but now cautious. Their approach angles more conservative, their separation wider than standard swarm doctrine. They were improvising, adjusting to a situation their training hadn't prepared them for. Meyer positioned himself for a high-side attacker, classic energy tactic. Climb above the target, roll inverted, pull through into a diving gun run that converted altitude into speed, and created a difficult defensive geometry for the target. The American would have to pull hard into the vertical to counter it, bleeding speed, creating an opportunity for Weber to attack from below. It was solid tactics. It should have worked, but Johnson wasn't flying defensively. Instead of pulling vertical to counter Meyer's approach, Johnson rolled inverted and pulled toward the earth, a splittist maneuver that used his existing speed to accelerate downward, away from Meyer's planned gun solution, while simultaneously repositioning for an angle on Weber. The maneuver was aggressive, unorthodox, and exactly wrong according to standard defensive doctrine, which was why it worked. Meyer's high-side attack dissolved into empty air. His gun solution evaporated as the P-47 dropped away faster than he could adjust his dive angle. He tried to follow, pushing his nose down steeply. But the FW-190's acceleration in the dive wasn't enough to close the gap. The American was already pulling out, already repositioning, already converting the vertical maneuver into a horizontal attack run. Weber saw Johnson coming and broke hard left, pulling maximum GI, his vision graying at the edges, the FW-190's airframe protesting with aerodynamic groans. He was a competent pilot, not exceptional, but trained and experienced. He understood energy management, understood tactical geometry, but he was learning a cruel lesson. Competence wasn't enough against excellence. Backed by a superior aircraft in its element, Johnson's pursuit was relentless. The P-47 followed Weber's brake with surprising agility, not matching the FW-190's turn rate, but cutting inside the turn radius by virtue of better energy management. Johnson had entered the turn with more speed, had pulled slightly less G to maintain that speed advantage, and was now on a geometric intercept course that would put him in gun range within seconds. Weber's situation was deteriorating rapidly. He was defensive, reacting rather than acting, burning energy in hard turns that bought him seconds but cost him the speed he needed to escape. His fuel state was becoming a concern. Combat at full throttle consumed gasoline voraciously. He needed to disengage, but disengaging required creating separation, and separation required speed he no longer had. The alternatives narrowed to one. Weber rolled inverted and pulled hard toward the earth, a desperation dive, hoping to use gravity and the FW-190's clean lines to outrun the pursuing P-47. It was a calculated gamble. If he could extend far enough, fast enough, he could level out at low altitude where the P-47's high-altitude advantages disappeared, where terrain masking might offer escape routes. Johnson followed him down. The altimeter unwound. Rapidly 18,000 feet, 16,000, 14,000, both aircraft accelerating, the P-47 closing the gap incrementally, the geometry tightening. Weber's dive angle steepened, dangerous decision this close to terrain, but preferable to letting the American get gun solution. At 12,000 feet, Johnson got his shot. The range was long for 100 yards, but Weber's dive was straight, predictable, the deflection minimal. Johnson touched the trigger, fired a short burst. Tracers reached out, falling slightly short, the ballistics affected by the high closing speed and dive angle. He adjusted, raising the nose fractionally, fired again. This time the tracers converged on Weber's aircraft. Hits sparkled along the fuselage, not catastrophic damage, but enough to puncture hydraulic lines, sever control cables, shatter instruments in the cockpit. Weber felt the impacts, felt the controls go slack, felt the rudder pedals go soft as hydraulic pressure bled away. He was still flying, but barely. The FW-190 was wounded, controllable only through brute force on the stick. Sluggish in response, altitude bleeding away. Landing was impossible, his gear hydraulics were gone. Bailing out was the only option. Weber chopped the throttle, pulled back on the stick to arrest the dive, tried to stabilize the aircraft long enough to get out. The airspeed dropped below 250 miles per hour. Still too fast for a safe bailout, but staying in the aircraft was suicide. He reached for the canopy jettison, pulled the handle. Nothing happened. The canopy mechanism was jammed, either from battle damage or mechanical failure. Impossible to know. Weber pulled harder, desperation replacing technique. The handle moved, but the canopy stayed locked. He was trapped inside a dying aircraft with 11,000 feet between him and the frozen German countryside rushing up to meet him. Johnson saw the FW-190's dive shallow, saw the erratic control inputs, knew the aircraft was crippled, but he could finish it. Another burst would likely send it down in flames, but he saw no canopy jettison. New parachute deployment. The pilot was still inside, fighting for his life. A decision point measured in heartbeats. Finish the kill, or break off and let the pilot try to survive. Johnson's thumb lifted off the trigger. He pulled away, climbing back toward altitude, scanning for additional threats. Weber's FW-190 continued its wobbling descent, mortally wounded but still airborne. Its pilot's fate uncertain. Above, Meyer had watched Weber's destruction and made his own calculation. 2 fighters gone or disabled in less than 3 minutes. The lone American P-47 had reversed a perfect tactical setup through combination of skill, aircraft capability, and sheer aggressive will. Continuing the engagement was suicide. Meyer broke off hard. diving away toward the east, toward friendly territory, toward survival. His radio call was terse, professional, stripped of emotion, acting all units. American P-47, westbound heading, highly aggressive, high-speed capability, do not engage alone. The warning was 2 minutes too late for Steins, possibly too late for Weber, but it would save other German lives in the hours and days ahead. Intelligence would be revised. Tactical assessments would be updated. The P-47 would be reassessed from inferior to dangerous. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 1 engagement. Johnson leveled off at 20,000 feet. Checked his fuel gauges enough to make England barely, and scanned the sky one final time. Empty. The Germans were gone. The bombers he'd been escorting were miles away now, heading home, probably unaware of the fight that had just occurred. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline aftermath, the body's response to combat stress. He consciously relaxed his grip on the stick, took several deep breaths through the oxygen mask, forced his heart rate back toward normal. The shaking would pass. It always did. Below, scattered across 20 miles of German territory. 3 Focke-Wulf 190s told 3 different stories. Steins is burned in a field, wreckage scattered, black smoke marking the grave. Weber's continued its uncontrolled descent. Its pilot still fighting the jammed canopy, his fate unknown, suspended in those final seconds between life and death. Myers raced east, its pilot alive but carrying knowledge that would change tactical doctrine. The sky was quiet again, cold, indifferent. Johnson turned west, toward home, toward England, toward debriefing, where he would tell the story in clipped, factual sentences that stripped away the terror and the fury, and the impossible precision required to survive. 4-1 odds, the score was written in smoke and shattered aircraft. The lesson was being learned in Luftwaffe briefing rooms. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a joke, it was a killer. Johnson's P-47 crossed the Dutch coast at 15,000 feet, its engine running smoothly despite the sustained combat power it had endured. The North Sea stretched below grey cold, indifferent to the drama that had played out miles inland. He reduced throttle to cruise setting, the engine note dropping to a steady drone, fuel consumption easing back toward survivable numbers. The radio came alive sporadically, other pilots checking in. Bomber formations reporting damage and casualties. Controllers at English bases coordinating landing sequences. Johnson listened but didn't transmit. His ammunition counters showed less than 20% remaining across all 8 guns. His fuel gauges hovered just above minimum reserve. He was combat ineffective but alive. The shaking in his hands had stopped, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that came after adrenaline burned away. He flew mechanically, trimming the aircraft for hands-off cruise. His body slumped in the seat, oxygen mask pressing against his face with each breath. The cold penetrated even his heated flight suit. Hours at altitude had leached warmth from his core. England appeared as a dark line against the horizon. He contacted Halesworth Tower, received landing clearance, configured the aircraft for approach. The landing gear extended with reassuring hydraulic sounds. Flaps deployed in stages. The P-47 slowed, descended, settled onto the runway with a chirp of tires on concrete. He taxied to the hardstand, shut down the engine, watched the massive propeller windmill to a stop. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft immediately, checking for damage, counting bullet holes, noting mechanical discrepancies. The crew chief climbed onto the wing, opened the canopy, helped Johnson with his harness straps. "Any problems, Lieutenant?" Johnson's voice was hoarse from oxygen and cold. "She ran perfect. 8 guns worked. Everything worked." The crew chief nodded, professional pride evident. He glanced at the ammunition counters, did quick mental arithmetic. "You put a lot of rounds downrange, sir. 3 FW-190s. 1 confirmed destroyed, 1 probable, 1 damaged." The crew chief's eyebrows rose. 3 German fighters engaged by a single P-47 was noteworthy. 3 casualties was exceptional. He made notes on his clipboard, data that would feed into maintenance logs and combat reports. Johnson climbed down from the wing, legs unsteady, muscles protesting after hours of tension. An intelligence officer approached with a clipboard in camera, standard procedure for any pilot claiming victories. The debriefing would be thorough, methodical, slightly skeptical until evidence corroborated the claims. They walked to the debriefing room. Johnson accepted coffee, bitter, lukewarm, perfect, and sat at a wooden table scarred by cigarette burns and coffee rings. The intelligence officer, a captain whose name Johnson couldn't remember, opened a fresh notepad. "Walk me through it. Time, position, altitude, everything you remember." Johnson told it chronologically, stripped of emotion. The separated position, the 4 FW-190s approaching, the initial dive, the reversal, the gun runs. He described Steins's aircraft burning, the pilot bailing out, Weber's damaged aircraft in an uncontrolled dive, Meyer breaking off and fleeing east, Schragder's earlier disengagement. The intelligence officer wrote steadily, asking clarifying questions. "You're certain of the kill on the first aircraft?" "Positive." "Wing fire, structural failure, pilot bailed out." "The aircraft impacted terrain, location, Johnson provided coordinates as best he could. Estimate navigation at combat speeds was approximate, but the general area was identifiable. Snow-covered farmland, approximately 15 miles southeast of Hanover. Impact would have left wreckage and a burn scar visible from the air. The officer made notes. Confirmation would come from multiple sources. Other pilots might have witnessed parts of the engagement. Reconnaissance photos might show wreckage. German records captured after the war would provide definitive evidence. But Johnson's claim had the ring of accuracy, specific details, conservative estimates, no exaggeration. The second aircraft, the probable damaged, loss of control, descending through 10,000 feet when I broke off. Pilot attempting to bail but canopy appeared jammed. I lost visual when I climbed back to altitude. That would be classified as a probable kill, severe damage making survival unlikely, but no confirmed crash observed. If Weber had somehow survived, gotten the canopy open, bailed out successfully, he would be one of the fortunate few. If not, the FW-190's wreckage was scattered somewhere in the German countryside, another kill that might never be officially credited. The third aircraft, Myers, was listed as damaged. Hits confirmed by gun camera footage. If the camera had functioned, the aircraft had broken off under its own power, suggesting repairable damage rather than catastrophic failure. The debriefing lasted 90 minutes. Every detail extracted, recorded, cross-referenced with mission timelines and known German unit positions. When it finished, Johnson signed the report, dated it, walked out into the cold February afternoon. Other pilots from his squadron were gathered near the operations buildings, comparing notes, the informal debrief that happened between men who had just survived another mission. They saw Johnson approaching, recognized the walk of someone who had been in serious combat. "Heard you mixed it up pretty good, Bob." Johnson lit a cigarette, his hand steady now, for 190s. "Killed one for sure, maybe two." The group went quiet. Single combat against multiple German fighters was rare. Winning that fight was rarer. One of the other pilots, a lieutenant named Walker, studied Johnson's face. 4-to-1 odds. "How'd you manage it?" Dove used speed. Picked them off when they tried to follow. The Jug can dive faster than the 190. They didn't know that. It was understated. The way pilots talked about survival reducing chaos and terror to technical decisions, but the others understood. They had flown the same aircraft, fought the same enemy, knew what it took to survive, let alone win. The respect was unspoken but absolute. Across the North Sea, in occupied territory, the aftermath unfolded differently. Oberleutnant Heinrich Steins landed in a farmer's field 3 miles from where his aircraft had crashed. Local Wehrmacht troops reached him within 30 minutes. A downed pilot was both an asset and a witness, his testimony valuable for tactical intelligence. They transported him to the nearest Luftwaffe base, where a doctor examined him for injuries and an intelligence officer waited with questions. Steins was physically unharmed but psychologically shaken. He had flown over 80 combat missions. He had faced British Spitfires over the Channel, Soviet Yak-3 south over Ukraine, American bombers over the Ruhr. He had survived situations where death seemed certain, but this engagement had been different. The American pilot hadn't fought defensively. The P-47 hadn't tried to escape. It had reversed the attack, used speed and firepower with surgical precision, and killed experienced pilots in seconds. Steins's assumptions, the bedrock beliefs that informed his tactical decisions, had been wrong. The intelligence officer wanted specifics: aircraft type, markings, pilot behavior, weapons effectiveness, aircraft performance. Steins provided what he could remember, but memory compressed under stress. The fight had lasted less than 5 minutes, yet those minutes contained lessons that would require hours to properly analyze. "The P-47 dived faster than our aircraft could follow," Steins reported. "Much faster." The intelligence briefings said the aircraft was heavy and slow. This was incorrect. The officer wrote carefully. Intelligence assessments were built on accumulated reports, individual observations that, when combined, formed operational understanding. If multiple pilots reported similar experiences, doctrine would be revised. Weapons effectiveness: devastating. 8 machine guns, very high rate of fire. My aircraft was destroyed in approximately 2 seconds of sustained fire. The wing structure failed from the damage. More notes: the .50 caliber machine gun had been assessed as less effective than 20mm cannon, smaller projectile, less explosive force per hit, but volume of fire compensated. 8 guns firing simultaneously created a cone of destruction that overwhelmed defensive armor. The intelligence officer would compile Steins's report with others, a growing database of American fighter capabilities that painted a picture different. From initial assessments, the P-47 wasn't inferior, it was different. With strengths that German tactics hadn't properly accounted for. Feldwebel Otto Meyer landed at his home base 90 minutes after the engagement. His FW-190 showed multiple bullet strikes, 7 holes in the fuselage and right wing. 1 hydraulic line severed, control cables damaged but functional. The ground crew photographed the damage, measured bullet hole angles, extracted bullet fragments for analysis. Meyer's report echoed Steins's. The P-47 was faster in the dive than intelligence had indicated. Its firepower was greater than anticipated. The pilot, whoever he was, had demonstrated exceptional skill and tactical aggression. Engaging such aircraft one-on-one was inadvisable. Numerical superiority was necessary, and even then, casualties should be expected. His recommendation was direct. Revised tactical doctrine: the P-47 should be treated as a primary threat, not a secondary concern. Aftermath, Section 2, Feldwebel Hans. Weber never made it home. 3 days after the engagement, Wehrmacht troops searching the crash site found his Focke-Wulf 190 embedded in frozen earth 20 miles southeast of Hanover. The impact had been catastrophic. The aircraft struck at a steep angle, traveling over 300 miles per hour, disintegrating on contact. The cockpit section was identifiable only by fragments of instrument panel and sections of armored glass. Weber's body was recovered from the wreckage, still strapped into his seat. The canopy had never opened. Whether he had died from combat damage, loss of consciousness from control difficulties, or the impact itself was impossible to determine. The official report listed him as killed in action, February 11, 1944. Cause aerial combat. He was 23 years old. He had flown 47 combat missions. His personal effects letters from home, a photograph of a girl in money, a pocket watch that had stopped at the moment of impact were collected, catalogued, and eventually mailed to his family with a formal condolence letter from his commanding officer. Weber's death was unremarkable in the statistical sense. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots at an accelerating rate through 1944. Combat attrition that exceeded replacement training capacity every week brought similar notifications to German families. But his death represented something specific: confirmation that American escort fighters had evolved from nuisance to genuine threat. The wreckage itself told a story. Luftwaffe technical intelligence officers examined the bullet damage patterns, measured impact angles, analyzed the hydraulic system failures. The examination confirmed what surviving pilots had reported: the .50 caliber weapons were devastatingly effective when concentrated, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage even without explosive rounds. The technical report was filed, distributed to fighter units across the Western Front, incorporated into revised tactical briefings. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion. American P-47 aircraft demonstrate superior high-speed dive characteristics. Engagement should prioritize altitude advantage and avoid extended diving pursuits. Numerical superiority of at least 2-to-1 is recommended for successful interception. The subtext was clear. The assumptions that had characterized early assessments were obsolete. The war was changing. At 8th Air Force Headquarters in England, intelligence officers compiled combat reports from the February 11th missions. Johnson's engagement was one data point among hundreds: bomber losses, fighter claims, flak damage, navigation errors, weather impacts. But certain patterns were becoming evident. P-47 loss rates were declining. Kill ratios were improving. Bomber formations with aggressive fighter escort were experiencing lower attrition than those with passive defense-only escort. The operational philosophy shift, encouraging fighters to pursue and destroy German aircraft rather than merely protecting bombers, was producing measurable results. General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, reviewed the statistics during his morning briefing. The numbers supported his doctrinal gamble. Aggressive fighter operations were destroying German fighters, which meant fewer German fighters attacking bombers, which meant lower bomber losses and higher mission effectiveness. The P-47 is proving itself, his intelligence chief noted. Early skepticism is being replaced by operational success. The Germans are adjusting their tactics in response. Doolittle nodded. He had staked significant command authority on the belief that American fighters could dominate German fighters in air-to-air combat. The evidence was accumulating in his favor, but evidence came at a price: pilots killed, aircraft lost, missions failed. The successful outcomes, like Johnson's survival, obscured the casualties that didn't make it home. The broader strategic picture was shifting. Air superiority over Europe, contested bitterly since 1942, was beginning to tilt toward the Allies. German fighter production remained high, but pilot quality was declining. Experienced aces like Steins were being shot down or removed from frontline duty. Replacements arrived with minimal training, sometimes fewer than 20 flight hours in type before entering combat. They died quickly. American production, meanwhile, was overwhelming. Republic Aviation's factories in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, produced P-47s at rates the Luftwaffe couldn't match. By early 1944, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been manufactured. Losses were replaced within days. Damaged aircraft were repaired and returned to service. The arithmetic of attrition favored the Allies increasingly, but statistics couldn't capture individual experience: the terror of combat, the skill required to survive, the psychological weight of killing and nearly being killed. Johnson's 3 victories on February 11th were 3 entries in a ledger, 3 marks contributing to broader trends. There were also 3 German pilots, one dead, one possibly dead, one alive but shaken, whose fates intersected with his in 5 minutes of violence at 25,000 feet. In the days following the engagement, Johnson's status within the squadron shifted subtly. He had already been respected as a competent pilot. Now he was recognized as something more, a pilot who could win impossible odds, who understood the P-47's capabilities intimately, who could teach others to survive. Colonel Zemke pulled him aside after a mission briefing 3 days later. "I read your combat report. For 190's solo engagement, that's exceptional work." Johnson shrugged slightly, uncomfortable with praise. "I followed the doctrine, sir. Didn't try to turn with them. Used speed and firepower." "You did more than follow doctrine. You improvised under pressure, exploited their assumptions, and killed skilled pilots who had every tactical advantage except one: they didn't know what you could do." Zemke let that settle, then continued. "I want you to brief the new pilots. Tell them what you did, how you thought through the engagement. They need to hear it from someone who survived it." Johnson agreed. Over the following weeks, he conducted informal briefings for replacement pilots arriving from stateside training. He described the February 11th engagement in detail: the tactical geometry, the decision points, the moments where survival hung on correct choices, made in fractions of seconds. The briefings were valuable because they were honest. Johnson didn't glorify combat. He described the fear, the uncertainty, the luck involved alongside skill. He emphasized aircraft capabilities, the P-47's dive speed, its ruggedness, its firepower, and how to exploit those capabilities while avoiding tactical situations where the aircraft's weaknesses mattered. "The Germans expect you to fight their fight," he told one group of replacements. "They want turning combat at medium altitude where their aircraft advantage. Don't give them that. Fight the Thunderbolts, fight speed, altitude, firepower. Dive on them. Shoot. Climb away. Repeat. Don't get fancy. Don't try to be a Spitfire. Be a Thunderbolt." The lessons were absorbed unevenly. Some pilots internalized them immediately. Others learned through painful experience. Some didn't survive long enough to learn. But the cumulative effect was improved tactical competence across the squadron. Survival rates increased marginally, not dramatically, but enough to matter statistically over months of operations. Johnson himself continued flying combat missions through spring 1944. He accumulated additional victories, confirmed kills, and probables, the tally growing as his skill and confidence compounded. By June, he was recognized as one of the 8th Air Force's leading aces, his name appearing in intelligence summaries and press releases. But the recognition felt hollow. Each victory represented a German pilot killed, men with families, training, lives interrupted by bullets and fire and falling aircraft. Johnson didn't hate them personally. They were opponents in a war neither side had chosen individually. The killing was necessary but not satisfying. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, he would reflect on the February 11th engagement with mixed emotions: pride in having survived and succeeded, sorrow for Weber, who died trapped in his cockpit, respect for Steins, who had fought skillfully before circumstance defeated him, and a quiet recognition that war reduced human beings to statistics, survival to luck, and skill in unknown proportions. The P-47 Thunderbolt's reputation transformation was complete by summer 1944, had begun as a questionable experimenter-heavy, radial engine fighter that seemed outclassed by European designs, had become the dominant American fighter in the European theater. Over 15,000 would eventually serve in combat. They would claim thousands of German aircraft destroyed, hundreds of locomotives and tanks demolished, countless ground targets obliterated. But the transformation didn't begin in factories or design bureaus. It began in combat, in engagements like February 11th, where individual pilots demonstrated what the aircraft could do when flown correctly by someone who refused to accept defeat. The Germans stopped laughing. They learned, adapted, revised their tactics, but the learning came too late and cost too much. The sky over Europe, contested so bitterly for years, was turning Allied. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked, once doubted, had become one of the instruments of that transformation. One pilot, one aircraft, one engagement. The ripples spread outward, changing doctrine, shifting perceptions, contributing to outcomes that would reshape Europe. The sky remembers nothing. Years after the last shot was fired, after peace treaties were signed and borders redrawn, the cold air at 25,000 feet remains unchanged, indifferent to the struggles that once played out in its thin atmosphere. The clouds still form and dissipate. The winds still blow from west to east. The sun still illuminates the spaces where men fought and died for reasons that seemed absolute at the time. What February 11th, 1944 taught, what every engagement like it reinforced, was that war is ultimately decided by human beings making split-second decisions under impossible pressure. Technology matters, doctrine matters, training and logistics and industrial capacity all matter. But when metal meets metal and lives hang in balance, what determines outcomes is the individual in the cockpit, the calculation made in heartbeats, the willingness to act when action means risking everything. Robert Johnson survived that day because he understood his aircraft completely, because his training had become instinct, because he refused to accept the role his opponents assigned him. The Germans laughed because their experience told them to laugh. The P-47 looked inferior. American pilots seemed inexperienced. 4-against-1 odds appeared insurmountable. They were wrong not because they were stupid or cowardly, but because war constantly evolves, and yesterday's truths become tomorrow's fatal assumptions. The Thunderbolt story is a reminder that capability exists independent of perception. The aircraft was always fast in a dive, always rugged, always capable of devastating firepower. But capability means nothing until demonstrated, until someone shows what's possible, until the enemy learns through painful experience that their comfortable assumptions were wrong. Heinrich Steins descended by parachute into captivity, his war ending in a farmer's field. Hans Weber died in flames and impact, never knowing if his struggle to escape meant anything. Otto Meyer returned home to fight another day, carrying knowledge purchased with his comrades' lives. Robert Johnson landed safely in England, exhausted and alive. Another mission survived in a war that would demand hundreds more. These weren't heroes or villains in the mythological sense. They were professionals doing brutal work under circumstances that stripped away everything except skill and will and chance. Some survived, some didn't. The difference often came down to factors no amount of training or courage could fully control. But what could be controlled mattered: understanding your tools, knowing your enemy, refusing to quit when circumstances turned desperate, making the correct decision in the half-second between life and death. These weren't guarantees. Nothing guaranteed survival in air combat, but they shifted probabilities, improved odds, gave skill a chance to overcome chance. The laughter stopped not because of a single engagement, but because that engagement represented a pattern. American fighters were improving, tactics were evolving, the qualitative edge the Luftwaffe had enjoyed was eroding. By war's end, the P-47 Thunderbolt would be recognized as one of history's great fighter aircraft, its reputation earned in thousands of engagements across multiple theaters. But it began in moments like February 11, 1944. One pilot, one aircraft. For opponents, 5 minutes that changed perceptions and contributed, in some small but measurable way, to outcomes that shaped the century. The sky remembers nothing, what history remembers, and the lesson endures. Never underestimate the determined, never assume superiority, never laugh at an opponent until the fight is finished, because Asommedes, the sky turns against you, and when it does, all the confidence in the world won't save you from the consequences of being wrong.